Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. This is Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is someone you probably know, Freddie deBoer. Freddie, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name is Freddie deBoer, and I'm a fourth year doctoral candidate at Purdue University, where I study literacy assessment and applied linguistics. And I blog on my own website, and I write for a bunch of places.
Great. So you wrote some interesting pieces in response to a piece that kind of took the internet by storm last week, which was Jonathan Chait's piece called "Not a Very PC Thing to Say," and
Hmm.
we decided to bring the bring the conversation to video. So probably most people who are watching this have at least heard of Chait's piece. I would recommend everyone read it, whether you agree with it or not. It's certainly an interesting, well constructed argument. At least I think so. And you wrote some pieces, maybe surprising some people by agreeing with a large part of what Chait had to say. Why do you think that surprised people, or why why do you think Chait is at least partially right?
Right. Well, yeah, so I've written a series of posts now, which we'll link to. Yeah, so if this is one of those situations, and I don't mean to sound like I think I'm some sort of a unique snowflake here, but
We're all unique snowflakes.
I have been both annoyed by sort of John Chait and like sort of his sort of coterie on this, and deeply annoyed by a lot of the people who have been criticizing John Chait. I would put it this way: I have a number of very deep disagreements with John Chait, and they're real disagreements, and both on this issue and others. And I've been fighting with John Chait for a long time. It might be a one-way fight, but I've been complaining about John Chait
Right.
for at least 5 years. And you can very easily check my record and find that
Right. So
out.
your political beliefs are do not align with Jonathan Chait's political beliefs along many axes.
I am well to the left of John
Hmm.
Chait, and in fact, one of the things we'll talk about is, John Chait. It's funny that John Chait complains about language policing because he's someone who works overtime to sort of set the boundaries of political discourse very narrowly.
Hmm.
But anyway, however, so John Chait writes this piece and he talks about how he thinks political correctness is hurting sort of the political conversation. And a lot of people wrote pieces that essentially said there's no such thing as political correctness, and the kind of like impositions on free expression that John Chait are talking about aren't happening, and there really aren't all these extreme problems.
Right.
And I wrote a piece to say that that's just substantially not true, and it's not true where I live. And I think that the people who say it, although they have good intentions, largely don't know what they're talking about. So probably the most extreme example, or the most obvious example of this, was Amanda Taub, I think is how you pronounce her name,
Right. At
at
Vox, yeah.
Vox. And she wrote a piece that said political correctness does not
Right.
exist. That what John Chait is talking about doesn't actually happen. And I said in my first piece, how would you know? Because one of the things that's happening here is you have this sort of default demographic experience of elite media types, which means very largely people who went to elite colleges who now work in elite media.
Hmm.
They are a higher percentage of them are white than the regular population. A higher percentage of them are male, um, who don't have exposure to the kind of sort of language policing that does go on,
Hmm.
for example, on a college
Right.
campus.
And so you are in the belly of the beast. So I think that's why your perspective on this is very interesting. And you pointed out things that you have experienced where, kind of the things that Chait was saying happens and other people are saying, oh, this doesn't have not a big problem. You describe them in detail. So could you talk about some of the things that you've seen and that you wrote about?
Yeah, so I should put this. Let me give my complete sort of exposure. So um, I grew up at Wesleyan University, which is a university that I love, and I love its values. But Wesleyan was the inspiration for the movie PCU, which is a parody of early '90s era political correctness, a college
Yes,
movie.
I remember that
Um,
fine film.
yeah, where I grew up was based on that era of that college.
Hmm.
I was in the early 2000s a 30-hour a week anti-war activist for at least 3 or 4 years.
Hmm.
Um, I've remained highly political online now, and I work and I teach in the humanities department in a university. And so I am and have been for pretty much my entire life in the environs in which these things sort of happen.
Hmm.
And so what I said is, you know, um, I myself have seen the ways in which political correctness, and we can debate sort of the meaning of that term and how useful it is, where that lives. And so I've talked about things like, at an anti-war event that a group of I was associated with put together. A vet for peace said, other vets need to man up. This was a person who had been to Iraq. He said, other vets need to man up and to speak out against the war. And he was scolded by someone who I knew to be a 22-year-old student at an elite liberal arts college. And that sort of thing where there is a kind of hypersensitivity to language that overwhelms deeper and more important sort of philosophical and political issues.
Right. So just to clarify, so the person who was yelling at the veteran who said use the phrase "man up," what was their complaint?
The complaint is that "man up" is a gendered term, and it implies in saying "man up" that there is something more noble or stronger about men than women.
Right.
And this is a sort of a perfect example, and I do see this sort of thing all the time, despite what people saying that it doesn't exist, which is privileging a kind of language policing, right? So privileging this kind of looking for perfect language from everyone all the time over deeper issues of sort of political agreement and issues of sort of political philosophy. This person was someone who was speaking out against a horrific war. He did so from a position of considerable individual stakes. Right? He knew what he was talking about. He was on our side. And sort of the refusal to sort of see "man up," right, as a sort of just an idiom that we say, maybe an unfortunate idiom, but just the refusal to see it for what it was, just figurative language, and to privilege the sort of linguistic sort of policing over, like, okay, what's the actual political scenario that I'm in? That, to me, is the deepest issue here. Right. It's the way that we lose the forest for the trees. We stop seeing the deeper sort of political issues underneath language, and instead just so privilege making sure everyone says the right thing all the time that political discussion and political progress become impossible.
Right. So I think you said the phrase language policing a lot. I think that's maybe a better phrase to use than political correctness. Obviously, everyone kind of has an idea of what political correctness is, and we can discuss the different interpretations of it. But, if you take the frame larger and say language policing, you can see that this kind of thing exists on both in conservative world, liberal world, left world, right world. And, I think kind of the divide is not between people who, care about the experiences and feelings of groups that are not white men and the people who don't care about them. I think, obviously that is a divide, but a more important divide, I think, is between people who think more speech is a good thing and the answer, and people who think less speech is a good thing and the answer. And so the people who are language police think that less speech is a good thing, and there's some things, that you should not say, not that the government should prevent you from saying, but that social sanction should prevent you from saying. Right. And we can see this in any, you mentioned Chait, so kind of the Israel debate would be one area where language policing plays out on kind of like counter lines as well.
Right. And look, like I think you have to separate a few things here. I mean, one of the things that we do not do very well on the left is determining issues of like priority, right?
Right.
If you ask me in a vacuum, should people use the phrase "man up" and have it be indicative of sort of, of sort of strength or confidence or whatever, or responsibility, I say, yeah, that is a bad thing. But that there's actually people in the world, and you can meet many of them, who will come out and express, like, they think that women are fundamentally weaker or less trustworthy or whatever than men, right? Like, there are people who actually have a sexist philosophy that they will explicitly sort of express, right? And number one, like, if you're going to devote your energy anywhere, first, you should probably worry about those people. But number two, like, it's it's asking yourself, in this situation, right? I'm in a situation of sort of limited political resources, right? Like, outrage is a resource that we only have so much of.
Well, on Twitter, it seems like the outrage can sometimes be a renewable resource.
Right, but see, but that's even the perfect point. Like, so if you look, even some of the people who have been the most enthusiastic proponents of sort of outrage politics on Twitter now seem kind of exhausted and over it, and are no longer able to sort of, raise as much as they could. Even a lot of the people who sort of are most enthusiastic about this, I think, are now starting to question the costs.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm not a participant in it largely, but it seems just literally exhausting to.
It's literally exhausting, and so I wish that people, and again, like this one woman, she was a kid, and I forgive her, whatever, and it's not like a big deal. I certainly screw up plenty of times, but it's indicative of a broader refusal to understand the deeper sort of, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? How are we trying to accomplish it? And is this engagement right now, is my engagement, the way that I'm speaking out on this, likely to make the world a better place? And that's true even from the perspective of, I want to make people use less sort of less sexist and loaded language, right?
Right.
Even if you want people to stop saying "man up," and like I said, in a vacuum, I understand that. Is right now my effort to sort of shame someone for saying it, is that actually likely to produce a broader society-wide resistance to using that kind of language? And I would argue that it isn't.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, what your post that the first post you read about this really made me think is that like this kind of thing just is going to have to exhaust itself, because it's like heretic hunting. And what I said before, what it reminded me of was, the FBI would send infiltrators into far left groups in the 60s and 70s, and so the groups became obsessed with suspicion about who was informing on who was really a rat, and they kind of tore themselves apart, and they had like legitimate reasons to suspect that they were being infiltrated by G-men or whatever. But kind of any political or social movement that is has a large part of it is trying to say, oh, you are not pure, you need to leave. Like this is not going to be a flourishing political movement.
I mean, here's a statement that I just think is just true, right? And I want to preface this by saying this is a sort of descriptive statement and not a normative one. I'm not saying this is good that this is true. I'm saying that this just is true, which is human beings are not capable of constant vigilance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you look like a post 9/11 world, right, and we're in this kind of like 9/11 happens and we're in this crazy state of national fear. And one of the things that the government is saying and the Bush administration is saying is we have to be in a state of constant vigilance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have that goofy color-coded terror system,
right.
And people are saying like we have to maintain like in that immediate panic sort of stricken post 9/11 world, we have to maintain that level of vigilance all the time, and like we have to look at every potential target as carefully as we look at any potential target, right? So a nuclear power plant in like Kalamazoo, we have to pay just as much attention to that as a military base that's in New York, right?
Right, or even the wastewater treatment plant in Kalamazoo, right, because the terrorists could break in there and poison our water, our precious bodily fluids could be taken over. So yeah.
And the thing is once you say that you have to look at everything with the same, once you say that you have to check everyone out specially, like once you say you have to give special focus to everything, then you're saying you're giving special focus to nothing, right? Like because human beings are not capable of maintaining a sort of state of cat-like readiness all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's happening in academic left-wing circles is that the number of things that you can say that people don't just think are wrong to say, but that people see as existentially sort of damning of you, right? Like the number of things that you can say now that people think are like disqualifying of you as a good person just grows and grows. So I'll give you a perfect example. There's a post that came out recently on a website called Everyday Feminism. And the post says that it's ableist to use any kind of language that implies a kind of a physical action, like any kind of metaphorical language that implies a physical action, because that excludes people. So the examples that she said were things like, I see it from your point of view, or I see what you mean.
Right, because some people are blind, so they can't see.
Because some people are blind, right? And of course, when I say I see what you mean, that's metaphorical. I'm not literally saying my eyes are seeing what you mean, right? But we have to pretend now, apparently, that we don't understand metaphorical language. Another example, to say I stand with you, or we need to stand up to something, is and people think this is a joke. I promise you that's not a joke. I individually know people who think that to say we need to stand up to cancer is inherently an offensive, ableist sort of thing. Now, even totally separate from whether or not I think that is sort of a legitimate gripe. The point is, human beings are not capable, like as a species with our psychology and with our sort of neurology, we are not capable of so perfectly policing our language all the time that we're ever going to be able to eliminate all of these ways in which we might potentially accidentally offend someone.
Right.
Right? And so at some point, because on the left right now, you get sort of social credit for enlarging the number of things you can say that are wrong, right? Like one of the big things, like one of the big ways in some radical lefty circles, or not even radical, we'll talk about that, but one of the big ways that you should sort of give credit is if you say this is problematic, if you're the first one to find something problematic, you earn a kind of credit. You get a kind of cachet.
Mm-hmm.
But what that means is that the list of things that we are not allowed to say with no intent to do harm has grown so long that no one can possibly follow it. And what happens is that people burn out. Like after a while, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I knew who 5 years ago, I know now, who 5 years ago were the most sort of intense and dedicated and sort of passionate left-wing activists who have become kind of like totally apolitical soccer dads and soccer moms now. Because what they found is that human beings cannot maintain that level of ultra vigilance and ultra passion all the time.
Right.
And so in the long run, you're actually making it harder to improve the actual political problems that we're all united against.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. But what I wanted to ask you, especially since you are in academia, is this just kind of like something that can only happen in kind of the hothouse atmosphere of a campus where most of the people are between the ages of 18 and 22? You know, they're young, they don't have a lot of life experience, they're impressionable, they're being exposed to a lot of new ideas, and so this kind of thing takes hold. And something I've thought about before this was like, a lot of colleges have like weird traditions and like silly traditions, like they'll have like an annual like naked run or something, or like a primal scream or something, or like they'll have like where I went to college, they had secret societies. And like I think the reason that these things persist is that like it takes a couple years to realize like these things are actually stupid. And by the time you realize they're stupid, you've graduated, and there's a new group of 18-year-olds who think, oh, it's really fun to run through campus naked. Right. So like there's an obvious like natural maturation process that happens, and some people who are campus activists when they're 19 years old, when they're 26 years old, maybe they're married now and they have a full-time job, and they just like, even if they wanted to be, they can't devote their time to this anymore. But maybe they also see that like what they were doing when they were a campus activist was kind of silly. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that first, and I wrote something about this yesterday. Even if it were just happening on campus, I mean, there are millions of people on college campuses. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So,
right. So I'm not saying that things that happen on college campuses aren't important, because
right.
the people who are on elite college campuses now will be running the country in 30 years.
Right.
But like this thing can only flourish in like the closed world of a college campus.
Well, but I mean, look at Twitter, right? I mean, you're on Twitter, right?
Right.
And,
so Twitter is in some ways more like a college campus than it is like real life, because you kind of can pick your hermetically sealed world that you follow, and everyone agrees with each other in the way that like on a college campus, like everyone, most people are liberal, and everyone kind of agrees.
I see it, and I would not put it. I would not put it that way to say that it can only happen when you're young and when you're in a kind of enclave in this way. I will say that there is a very predictable burnout rate and burnout cycle. What I find, one of the things that I found odd, and I do want to get to some criticisms of mine of Chait's piece in a minute, but one of the things that I found odd in the piece is that he talked about like the potential like benefit of the burnout cycle. Like he says, oh well, people get exhausted and so they stop doing that. But here's the thing. The people who actually need the help that political correctness is designed to solve, right? And this we have to be absolutely adamant about, is that political correctness is a response to sexism, to racism, to incredibly deep structural oppression, right? And so the people that, political correctness emerges from a profoundly noble instinct to try to fix those things, right?
Right.
The problem with the burnout cycle is that the sort of, the white people who grow up middle class or affluent, who become educated at these elite liberal arts colleges, and who go on to do so much to sort of set the national agenda in the media, when they burn out, they have the capacity to burn out, right? Like burning out is, in a certain sense, a mark of privilege, because if you are a Sarah Lawrence grad, and I love Sarah Lawrence, it's a great college, but if you are that sort of stereotypical sort of white leftist, you have the advantage of being able to stop in a way that someone who is black, someone who's a woman, someone who's disabled doesn't have the ability to stop, because the structural oppression remains no matter what you choose to do.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, and you made that point in one of your recent posts. But I guess
Right.
the distinction I would draw is that so the white college grad can leave academic politics and after graduating kind of assume that their life will be more or less okay, without
Right.
any overturning the system or any sort of political change. And maybe the black college grad or the transgender college grad cannot make that assumption. But
Right.
if all these groups like continue the struggle, but like there's no they didn't actually change anything to begin with, they were just attacking each other and language policing and tone policing. Is continuing the struggle like a good thing, or should they just like give it up and try to like help people in a more concrete way?
Well, see, I guess my point is a little bit is operating at even somewhat of a lower level, that which is it's not that every woman of color is going to be an activist her whole life. She can decide to do activism or not. But what she can't choose is to be outside of sexism and racism.
Right.
So the white college grad who burns out and then leaves that cycle, right, has the advantage of being able to walk away from the sort of the consequences of living in a sexist and racist society, right? Like,
Right.
You can steep yourself in a while, you can do all the reading, and I do, and I think it's important to do that. But at some point, you can remove yourself, and because you don't suffer from structural racism, or if you're a man, from structural sexism, it ceases to exist for you.
Right.
A woman of color might decide, I want to stop doing sort of formal activism, but she still has to live in a racist and sexist society.
Right.
And so, and that's what I mean by a difference of stakes, which is that, I said that there appears to be people who come from the sort of white affluent left who have this tendency, this habit, to burst into the scene and to cause every conversation to become more and more emotional and angry, and then burn out and leave, which means that they've injected all of this negative emotion and all of this passion without having stakes, and so they have the ability to leave. And I can't tell you how many people I know. Again, there were people in my anti-war days who, if I was a 30-hour-a-week anti-war activist, they were 60-hour-a-week, and they were the most intense and dedicated people I know. And I know a lot of them, and they didn't go full Republican, but they just sort of kind of like apolitical people now who raise kids and have jobs, and they briefly got excited about Obama, and then and there's a lot of people on Twitter who think that will never be them, and I'm telling you, 3 years, 5 years, 10, I don't know how long it'll take, but a lot of people right now who think of themselves as these ally warriors are just going to go right back to the sort of American, sort of elite status game. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I want to ask you something. I think we're probably about the same age. So the Iraq War happened when I was in college, and I was not a social justice warrior in college, but I attended some anti-war protests. I was very against the war. I was shocked. Maybe it was my college bubble. When the pro-war talk started in 2002, I thought this will never happen. It's just crazy. I attended with my then girlfriend and now wife to protest in New York City, the Republican National Convention in 2004. So I was not like a committed activist, but I participated in some anti-war marches and stuff like that. So we failed. We did not prevent the Iraq War. It happened. We also failed to prevent the re-election of George W. Bush in 2004. And I remember that night very distinctly. I was a friend of mine was so disgusted that she vomited when we were watching the election returns. So we were like 21 around in 2004, and so we failed. But Obama was elected. The Iraq War, was ended. It was kind of is coming back somewhat with the campaign against ISIS. The Afghanistan war is winding down. Those were not victories of the anti-war left. Those were victories of electing Barack Obama. And kind of looking back on, my small campus activism and a lot of other stuff that was happening around that time, like, was anything accomplished at all? Was it just making ourselves feel good? Like, since you still call yourself an activist, like, what do you think about that?
Well, I said that I was an activist. I haven't been an activist for a long time.
Okay.
Activists believe in the power of positive change. No, so look, I think that that history is determined not by political parties and not by political protesters, but by underlying fundamental material conditions of the economy, and that George Bush giving way to Barack Obama had a lot to do with just a fundamentally broken American economy that was sort of floating on this massive pile of fake mortgage debt. And that things like the drawdown in Iraq and Afghanistan happened because of primarily of economic conditions. Is it worth it to be an activist? I mean, it depends on what you mean. It was something, we had troops in Vietnam for something like 9 years or 8 years before, advisors at one point, before there were serious mass Vietnam War protests.
Right. When I was thinking about this, I was trying to think what's the last victory that a campus protest movement had, and I mean, it's related to Vietnam, but even that wasn't, stopping the draft, I guess, would be the last one, right?
I mean, in a certain sense, history doesn't work that way, right? You can just as easily say that Richard Nixon ended Vietnam as you can say that anti-war protesters ended Vietnam, right? You can maybe even more accurately state that the sort of the proto-energy crisis, the sort of the gathering understanding that we were heading for an oil crisis in the early 70s did something to that. I mean, you can always study the sort of underlying economic conditions. The purpose of protesting is never to be able to sort of causally say, we did this, right? The purpose of political protesting is to sort of move the window, right? It's to change the conversation somewhat. And
okay, so this is the Overton window that I don't know if Glenn Beck came up with this phrase or just popularized it. So people who are Tea Party protesters were effective in many ways, and they really changed the conversation and changed the course of America by making the conversation circa 2010 to 2012 about debt instead of about housing or helping people who are unemployed.
I think that people who are a bit younger may not understand what this country was like in 2002, right?
Right. So it's funny. I just reread a couple days ago Art Spiegelman's "In the Shadow of No Towers." Did you ever read that?
I did not.
Okay, so it's his reaction to 9/11. It's Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse, the cartoonist and comic book artist. It was the things that he did immediately after 9/11 and through the beginning of the Iraq War. And yeah, there were things I had forgotten about that were just so crazy that were happening in the country. And it's incredible, 14 years later to kind of remember it, and also just to remember the utter fear of those early days after 9/11, thinking that our whole way of life was completely over and there were going to be mass terrorist attacks every week.
I mean, Peter Beinart, in the pages of the New Republic, called for a cull of the anti-war left from the Democratic coalition. He compared people who were opposed to the Iraq War to communists in the 1948 Democratic Party. And of course, the 1940, that was the time of, we conveniently like to pretend that sort of red baiting and anti-communist scares were a sort of product of Republicans and Joe McCarthy, but in fact, Democrats were viciously anti-communist. And Peter Beinart could go into the pages of the New Republic and expect a very friendly audience to say, we need to cut these people out of our coalition entirely, right?
Right, and Andrew Sullivan, who's turned his Iraq war support into a giant mea culpa. There was talk of fifth columnists and that kind of thing on academic campuses in particular, and it was super ugly. But the trauma was basically the country went insane. And Bin Laden what he did worked. He drove everyone insane, and he allowed us to create a quagmire in Iraq.
Right, and the thing is can I say that anti-war protesters sort of definitively changed the conversation by themselves? No, but there is a continuum between people marching in New York City in 2002, saying "Not in our name," and then by 2007, Barack Obama can call Iraq a dumb war, right?
And we should which makes me think that the first kind of speech that Barack Obama gave about a national issue was at a 2002 anti-war campaign where he came out against the Iraq War, and that became a key plank, separating him from Hillary Clinton, and really is
Hmm.
one of the main things that helped him win the primary.
And it was exactly why he became. It was a large part of why he became so synonymous with the youth vote, because among people of my generation, being against opposed to the Iraq War was a really big deal.
Hmm.
But I mean, in the general sense, I can't say much about sort of left wing victory because um, the real left wing is opposed to establishment power, and establishment power is powerful, right? And my default expectation is always that we lose. You, you don't protest because you think you're going to
Okay, so if you don't protest because you think you're going to win, and then being involved in this world involves like vicious backbiting and tone
win.
policing and being called out constantly, like this is like the movement itself is not going to thrive, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, and again, like, I mean, I would just say, you got any better suggestions? Like, there's no alternative to sort of muddling through. But I think this brings us back to John Chait, right?
Hmm.
Because one of the things that you're suggesting is about like the sort of the impotence of nonpartisan politics, right? Well, part of what made John Chait such a poor representative of sort of open and free debate is that I can't think of a prominent writer who has done more to limit and to sort of limit the boundaries of the serious than John Chait. I mean, John Chait is constantly saying that if you are anywhere on the left hand side of the spectrum, your first duty is to support the Democrats, right?
Hmm.
And I mean, when we'll link to a piece, he said, well, hey, you lefties might not like Hillary, but the only alternative is destruction, right? So it's amazing to me that someone who says that other people are trying to silence him is the same person who said to the left that the only alternative to Hillary Clinton is destruction, right? By
You
his
mean did he say this before 2008 or
No,
approaching
he said
2016?
this. I think it was in response to Doug Henwood's article in Harper's. This is like less than 3 months old.
Okay, all right, okay, yeah, I'm recalling this piece now. Okay, but you just
Yeah.
said something that I disagree with,
Okay.
which is Jonathan Chait's piece was about people trying to silence Jonathan Chait.
Well,
So
that's a good point.
okay, so I don't think that's. I think like almost all the left wing critics of Chait like interpreted the piece that way, and there are a lot of
Hmm.
things. Alex Perrine wrote this piece where he called Jonathan Chait a sad white man, and
Hmm.
I wrote a piece that I just posted on Medium that we'll link to, that kind of taking issue with this kind of debate where I have a thought experiment.
Right.
But yeah, I just didn't interpret the piece that way, and like, and Chait has, and maybe that's Chait's fault for writing it poorly. But
Mm.
I think Jonathan Chait is a white man with
Right.
a prominent outlet supporting him. Like he'll be fine. No matter all the angry people on Twitter yelling at him, like he's gonna be fine.
Right.
He can cash his paycheck.
Right.
But I thought the piece was mainly about people who are, this group he talks about, Binders Full of Women, this Facebook group that was set up to be kind of a casual networking conversation
Hmm.
place for female journalists. Kind of was taken over by PC discourse and people sniping at each other. So a lot of people just left because they didn't want to deal with it anymore.
Hmm.
And the people who are hurt by this are not the white men. The white men are going to be fine.
Right.
They're people who are in minority groups or groups without any power who don't want to toe the line, and then they just either decide they're not going to say what they think, or they kind of withdraw and move to a different group.
Right. And in fact, and it's funny because no matter how much I kind of larded my own pieces on this with sort of saying I'm fine, I still got people sort of interpreting me as saying that like, oh, woe is me.
Right.
And so, I mean, and
And
for, I
this
mean,
is identity politics because people
right.
think everything is about them, and it's expressing our it's like it's almost like the me decade kind of thing. Like
Right.
let's talk about me. That was in the Tom Wolfe's essay where he coined the phrase the me decade. Like Jonathan Chait can write a piece. Obviously, he's a white man, and anything he writes and says is going to be through the filter of a straight white cisgendered male.
Hmm.
But
Right.
he's making a larger point, and he brings a lot of evidence about a conservative Muslim college student who was fired from his spot at the student newspaper and had
Right.
hooded assailants deface his dorm room door because he wrote a kind of gently mocking piece.
Hmm.
And any group, any outgroup has its own norms, and if you violate those norms, you're looked down upon and maybe you're cast out of the group. And it's a white man can find an easier group to
Right.
belong to than a black woman or something like that.
Yeah, and I find the thing that I find most frustrating. One of the things I find most frustrating from critics of some of the things I've written is the presumption that what I'm saying is that we should be more nice, and that the point is like emotional, like we shouldn't be so mean to people. And I just
Right.
want to let me give you like some background for this. I mean, like sort of pertaining to that activism. I mean, I have been through the wars. You know, the toxicity and the backbiting and the infighting that I sort of experienced in the anti-war movement, that puts any Twitter storm sort of to shame. I remember fights if we put a demand about Palestine on our anti-war march in 2004 or whatever, will that necessarily be anti-Semitic? And should we allow Answer to get involved? And if Answer is involved, does that make our march Maoist?
Oh, that's funny you mentioned that. So, as a 20 or 21-year-old college student who wanted to go protest the Republican National Convention in 2004, I don't know how we found it. A friend of mine found which protest we could go to. That was like a day when none of us had classes. I remember it was right before classes started in September or late August, September of 2004. And we went to the protest. And it was sponsored by Answer. And I had never heard of Answer before. I didn't know who they were.
Right.
And later saw things that they were like, I mean, if you want to call them Maoist, I don't know, but so I was like an unwitting pawn in the attempt by the Maoists or to hijack the left or something, just because I didn't know any better.
Right, and so like the notion that like I'm scared off by, I mean, like I have been through things that that I would consider far nastier. And by the way, it's not just activist politics either. I mean, I was living in Connecticut. And I was stumping, handing out bumper stickers and putting up signs for Ned Lamont.
Oh, right? Yes.
And which, by the way, that's the way that they always tell us they want us to do it, right? Which is to primary someone, which is to, when you have Joe Lieberman, who was literally one of the worst senators in the country at the time. So we primaried him.
Right.
We won. And of course, what happened is that tons of the sort of national liberal figures who would constantly tell us to primary people were aghast that we had primaried Joe Lieberman.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob Weisberg in Slate wrote one of the most sort of reprehensible pieces I've ever read in my life, scolding us for having gotten rid of, someone who had been described already as George Bush's favorite senator at that point. And then just battles between sort of the West Hartford sort of establishment liberal people who supported Joe Lieberman in Connecticut and the more sort of activist base. So I've been through all that nastiness. It has nothing to do with being nice, and it's certainly not for my benefit, right?
Right.
What I have seen as an activist and as a college educator and as a student at several different institutions is that there's a lot of people who are a lot less secure in their political identity than I am, right? A lot of them are very young. A lot of them don't know much about the way that the world works. And they get scared away from left-wing politics because the moment that they step out of line, they get smushed.
Right. Right.
I mean, and it's like, and I get some emails. I got some emails from some people saying, "Oh, why can't these kids just sort of suck it up? If you say something that's sexist and you're a 19-year-old and people start yelling at you at a meeting, why can't you just get over it, right?" And I'm like, hey, were you never 19? Like, do you not like the idea that like some 18-year-old girl from Gary, Indiana, should come to campus already with a perfect vocabulary for talking about race, which is complicated, right? Mm-hmm. Someone who has the best intentions and someone who genuinely believes that that racism exists and that wants to help fight it, but that doesn't know all of these linguistic codes that educated people like I do know. The idea that you should be able to berate that person until they run screaming from the movement and that's a positive thing is so insane to me.
Right, I agree.
It's so insanely counterproductive.
Yeah, so that person, what they're gonna do, it's not like they're gonna go and have like a self-criticism session. The 19-year-old, they're gonna go join the a cappella group on campus.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff that these kids can do with their spare time, and if one of them involves being constantly harassed and attacked for saying seemingly innocuous things, they're gonna go join the rugby team or something else.
Right. And let me say this. I am asking for people on the left and people who undertake these kind of language policing behaviors to think a little bit more tactically and strategically about how to build a movement. I will 100% admit and recognize and say up front that it's easier for me to ask people to be strategic because I am a straight white man, right? Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree with that. I'm absolutely saying this from a position of privilege. at the same time, I don't know what the alternative is, right? Like whenever I meet a young lefty, and I meet them all the time, I get a lot of people who come up to me on campus. I got people who email me, whatever. Whenever I meet a young lefty, the first question I always ask is, are we winning or are we losing? Right? It's the very most important question. And the thing is if you listen to what people say and take it seriously, then the answer to that question has to be that we're losing, right? Because every statement of the type, the world is filled with injustice, is another way to say my side is losing. If you're making the claim that the world is deeply unjust, then necessarily your political movement is losing. I think we are losing, right? And so the question is, when you're losing, what do you do to win? And it's not just that, like, not everybody adopts my vision of how to build a movement or how to enlarge the coalition. It's the notion that asking any questions about how to do that confronting that question is inherently an act of bad faith, right? Mm-hmm. That the only reason you could want to ask, is this best for the movement, is because you're going to tone police or you're going to mansplain or whatever else. That there's no such thing as a legitimate strategic concern about what is the best way to build and grow a functioning left-wing coalition. I just find that so destructive.
Okay, well, I want to ask you about, so you said, you think we're losing. So let's talk about one thing that, this is wrapped up with in some ways, which is, the struggle for gay rights and gay marriage. So it seems like we're on the cusp of gay marriage being the law of the land in all 50 states. So this is like a historic victory. It's like probably one of the fastest, kind of civil rights victories in American history from, 2004 when the first when Massachusetts legalized gay marriage through their state court to 2015 when we may have it in the entire country. So this is like a huge victory that I think we would both agree. So we in quotes we are both straight men are our side is winning on this. But like who is the person who drove this conversation the most? It's Andrew Sullivan. And the people who are accusing each other of tone policing or whatever, and the campus activists, like they did not have much to do with this. I mean, I remember, so I was in college in 2004. I remember when this came up, and when you're in college, you're probably not thinking about marrying anyone. So it really is not kind of the concern of a 21-year-old activist, because it's gay or straight, a 21-year-old usually isn't getting married in this country. So and the process that how gay marriage became, the eventual victory of gay marriage came about through kind of bringing the group that was once the out group into like bourgeois America. And, the reason it's winning is because, two 50-year-old lesbians who are raising adopted children want to get married to each other. And, most people, if they looked at that, they would say that, that's totally fine. It doesn't affect my life at all. And it's a good thing for the world. Whereas like the kind of the radical activism seems to me much more about splitting people into different groups, saying, that this is heteronormative. And a lot of radical gay activists were opposed to Sullivan and gay marriage because they saw it as, like making them bourgeois. So, like, what do you think about that?
Well, I would express it a little differently. I think there's one thing. I don't think that. So number one, I both agree with radical queer activists who think that the push for gay marriage has in effect turned what was once a radical movement into a wing of the Democratic Party. I think that's just true, and that's a problem. I also think that securing gay marriage for everyone, I think, is a massive victory, because simply the fact that it existed, even if I thought that marriage was completely a sham institution, the fact that that was a deep sort of inequality that existed means that it should have been fought. Where I would part ways with you, Aryeh, is I don't think that the issue was brought into bougie consciousness. I think precisely the reason why the issue, or a big part of the reason why the issue has been so successful, is because it doesn't threaten economically bougie interests. The only way that you're ever going to solve the race problem in the United States is with some kind of massive economic restructuring, so that the massive black-white wealth gap, the massive black-white income gap is healed, right? Like,
okay, well that makes me think we're never going to solve the race problem then, because that's some kind of massive economic upturning of the system. Like that doesn't happen,
Well, I mean, it doesn't ever happen. I mean,
Well,
it
I
just
mean,
happened. It happened in 1918 in Russia, right? Like,
okay,
um,
well, Freddie, we all saw what happened there. I mean, seriously,
we can.
like upturning, like overturning the system, like is not going to happen in America, don't you think? Or I mean, am I buying into buying into the man's vision there?
I think history is long, and I think that that history responds to material conditions, and I think that we're going to have an opportunity as the United States ceases to be the hegemon. I think that lots of things are going to change. I don't know, if you ask me are large scale reparations sort of politically plausible in the short future, the answer is no. But I also think that this is a country that tells itself that it is dedicated to eradicating racism, but is unwilling to undertake the kind of actual structural reforms that it will take. So the part of the reason why gay marriage, and again, this is a wonderful thing, but part of the reason why gay marriage has had such meteoric success is that it is not economically threatening to the establishment economic interests, right?
Right, but you could say the same thing about interracial marriage, and obviously, society's become less racist, but it took until 1967 or so for Loving versus Virginia, and there's all sorts of fears about miscegenation and things that were a big part of American history, but and interracial marriage has kind of slowly crept up as the years have gone by, but there's victories that took a lot longer than gay marriage that did not threaten the power system.
Sure. Again, establishment power is powerful, right? It takes time. It takes a long time to change things. I mean, here's something that I say sometimes. So Gandhi has this famous line: "Think of the poorest man you've ever seen in your life, and ask if your next act will be of any use to him."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I tell young lefties all the time, invert that, right? Think of the most privileged person you've ever seen in your life, and ask if your next act will be any threat to them. Right? So, think of Uncle Pennybags from the cover of Monopoly, right?
Right.
What does he care if you get married? Right? How does it threaten him if he gets married?
Yeah, he probably owns a stake in the wedding
industrial industry. That's
exactly.
right. And so he doesn't give a shit if you get married, but what threatens him is the possibility of actual economic justice, because that would entail his relative position of power to the rest of America would have to be reduced.
Mm-hmm.
But this actually gets to something that I want to say, which is one of my major beefs with Chait's piece is the notion that this can be simply mapped onto a sort of spectrum of extremity, where the people who do the language policing, the people who are politically correct, are the radicals, and he's the centrist Democrat, and so he's the target of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not true, right? And this is the thing. One of the oldest and nastiest inter-left battles, and we have a lot of them, is between sort of socialists and Marxists and people who are seen as, where we often pejoratively call people involved in identity politics. In other words, fights constantly break out between people who sort of argue the sort of supremacy of economic issues and people who argue the supremacy of racial and gender and sexuality issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Jacobin magazine is this wonderful socialist Marxist magazine that Bhaskar Sankara started, and they care a lot about race and about sex and about gender and sexuality, but they're constantly getting dinged for being sort of white man's socialism, despite the fact that it's a non-white guy who started it anyway.
Right.
And that is a battle that I have observed personally my entire life. I mean, that has been going on for a really long time.
Right. So I joked on Twitter a couple of days ago. The Koch brothers invented identity politics as a way to distract the left, and it worked. If this was like a plot to get people infighting instead of working together. So there's a way to understand the history of Southern racism as let's pit the poor whites against the poor blacks, and they'll hate each other, and then the rich whites will be fine instead of the poor people of all races uniting against the rich people.
Right, and the people who taught me to be suspicious of these kind of politics, number one, we're non-white and we're women, many of them, but they are the actual radicals. So the most trenchant critics I know of this is not John Chait. Some of the biggest critics are people like Adolph Reed. So Adolph Reed is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a longtime activist. He himself is a person of color, and he is ruthless in his critique of sort of identity politics, language policing, and things, because he sees it as a distraction from the structural economic issues that create inequality in America.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very important because there's a stereotype, and it's not entirely unfounded, which is of the white socialist saying it's not about race or it's not about gender, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that's offensive. Of course it's about race, right? Of course it's about race. Of course it's about gender. The point is that the mechanism through which gender inequality and racial inequality are perpetuated in this country is economic. In other words, the most important function of racism, the way that racism is structurally enforced in the system, is not through people saying the N-word. It's not through people having nasty thoughts in their head. The way that racism is perpetuated in the system is that black people continue to make a small percentage of what white people make. They have far less wealth. They're less likely to be insured. Their unemployment rate is higher. So those things. So the point is not that it's not about race or that it's not about gender, but that economics is the only level on which you can actually attack the system in order to make a meaningful change.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no recognition for John Chait that there is this divide on the left, because he sees everything to his left as the loony left, and the only meaningful expression of politics is being a Democrat or a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's it. That's an interesting critique. Do you want to talk about the kayfabe, if that's how you say that word?
Yeah. So Adolph Reed. So kayfabe is this idea for professional wrestling, and the idea is that you never drop the pretense that it's unscripted, right? Now, I want to be careful for the wrestling fans in the audience. This is a point of real private.
Yes. Don't okay. Sorry, I won't make a joke. Go ahead.
Professional wrestling is not fake, right? You actually are like getting slapped in the face, and it hurts, and it's dangerous. Professional wrestling is scripted so that the outcome of the match is already
right. It's fixed. The fix is
right.
it.
Right. And so traditionally, there's been this idea of kayfabe, which is you keep up the pretense that what you are doing is completely on the level all the time. Adolph Reed has this critique of sort of Twitter politics, online politics, as being filled with kayfabe, which is part of the difficulty is once somebody claims to have a particular kind of grievance that arises from race or from gender or from sexuality or whatever, the ethic now is that you can never question whether or not that is sincere, right? In other words, you can't imply that someone is sort of making a claim of racism or sexism or whatever in a way that is self-serving or frivolous or just generally fraudulent.
Right. So if someone said something, and you tried to challenge it, you would be accused of white-splaining or mansplaining, or you would be told to check your privilege.
Right. And so what that results, the idea of kayfabe is like, as long as you are in that sort of one of those groups and you are willing to sort of maintain your claim that this is a completely serious claim of racism or sexism or whatever, then you get this kind of invulnerability no matter how absurd your kind of engagement is.
Mm-hmm.
So just a couple days ago, there was an accusation made in Valleywag by Dan Lyon that this sort of notorious activist Shanley Kane is faking it. Now, I've barely ever interacted with her work. I don't have an opinion on this, but Lyon's claim is that Shanley Kane is actually it's a work, like it's not
performance art.
It's performance art, that she doesn't actually believe it, that it's a way to kind of enforce what she wants and to sort of, because again, once you put on this mantle of being, speaking for these issues, there's an awful lot of people will say that you are just off limits and you cannot be criticized, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But what that means is that we've created a very direct and obvious incentive that if you're someone who wants to derail, or if you just want to build a cult of personality, or if you have sort of professional concerns, like if you think it'll be good for your career to become a sort of, a very prominent and vocal and harsh advocate for social justice, then we can just do it. And because we're never allowed to question your motives or to question your efficacy, that means that we're vulnerable to whatever you want to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is another thing where I think that most of the time, what we call political correctness is just an attempt by people to sort of say, hey, you should be more thoughtful about what you say, what your impact is on people, and you should be more humane and empathetic to people who aren't like you. And I think that's fine. But there's this notion that no one ever takes a personal gain, and I just don't think that's true, right? And
Right. So what you're making me think of, I'm sorry, I keep referring
okay.
to decades-old Tom Wolfe essays in this conversation. Radical Chic and Mad Mag the Flat Catchers. I mean, he kind of had this situation mapped out 40 years ago. We'll link to those essays if they're publicly available. This is so the idea that this is can be performance art, and this is. And for a lot of people, even if it's not explicitly performance art, it's kind of like this is just fun. This is just like a fun thing to do. Arguing with people on Twitter is kind of just a pastime, and then your point that once those people get sick of the game and move on, nothing has actually changed, and the people who can't move on because they are not privileged, they're still stuck with their problems, and it's made even worse by the fact that the people who were egging on the fight felt like they were accomplishing something when really they were doing the opposite.
Right, and so like. Again, like not to reference my decade-old anti-war activism, but it would happen all the time, and it happens all the time in activist circles where you have two people who have some kind of a disagreement that can be a completely legitimate disagreement, like should our group do this event, or should we make a statement on this, or how should we organize ourselves? And those fights become very heated, and what often tends to happen is that the side that wins is the first to make a claim of sexism or racism or whatever against the other side. And because of this ethic, this notion that we can never question the legitimacy of those claims, that once someone says, you are guilty of sort of racial insensitivity, or you are guilty of sexism or misogyny, that means that there's this built-in incentive to use that language, to be the first to make that accusation so that you get what you want. And I think that the vast majority of times when people say, I think this is racist or sexist or this is problematic, they're being completely sincere. But I have also personally witnessed in groups that I've been part of and in classes I've been in, that when someone says, oh yeah, well what you're saying is racist or what you're saying is sexist, it does happen that those claims are frivolous and they're just used in order to sort of for social gains. And a movement, a healthy functioning political movement, needs to be able to say at times, yes, we recognize the legitimacy of most claims of racism or most claims of sexism or most claims of homophobia. But we also have to be able to say, you know what, you're just saying that in order to invoke power on someone. And right now we do not have that ability. There is no norm within the sort of broad American left right now to be able to say, yes, of course racism and sexism are huge issues, and of course there's privilege, and of course there's inequality, but your individual claim right now, what you're saying right now is not true. There's no system in which you can say that now. And that is
the thing you could say is just say that's bullshit.
Right.
Because a lot of it is bullshit. But
I invite you to try, right? Like in certain...
Okay, so I would be tossed out. And of course, the fact that we are both white men having this conversation means that there's a large percentage of the audience that will tune us out, or if they listen to us, will just attack us for being white men talking about this.
But the thing is like, I can tick off every demographic group that we recognize as legitimately oppressed, and name people from those groups who don't like this kind of politics, right? Michelle Goldberg is a woman, and she's written a lot about toxic Twitter wars, right? Dan Savage is gay, and he writes an awful lot about how these kind of politics and language policing can go wrong and make it harder to achieve gay rights. Adolph Reed is a long-time black activist with a long history of labor organizing who has very deep critiques of this kind of politics. Yasmin Nair is a gay woman, a queer woman of color who is ruthless in her critiques of these things, right? So you can't just sort of make a blanket claim like, oh, this is just sort of, white people have these concerns with this kind of language policing, but everybody in these demographic groups supports it. That's just not true,
Right, and that gets back to Chait's point about the, people in the minority group who feel shouted down or silenced by the, more farther out on the fringes members of their group. There's something I was having a conversation with someone over email, and I want to try this out on you. So, one thing that would be a great thing to happen in America would be if everyone had access to affordable dental care. Mm-hmm. So Obamacare guarantees, or at least tries to guarantee, access for everyone to affordable medical care. But dental care, for some reason, is like this kind of add-on a lot of times. So like, even though I'm a white middle-class person, I don't have dental insurance. So I pay out of pocket if I have to go to the dentist, but I have enough money that if my tooth hurts, I can go to the dentist. So I don't even know why, like, dental care was not included in Obamacare. I assume it was too expensive.
Right.
But then you think like dentists are often wealthy people, and wouldn't they want the government to, subsidize them to treat more people, so they would end up getting more money. So I don't know, and I know I actually had a healthcare plan through the Obamacare exchange in New York State last year, and there was a dental add-on for some of the plans, but it wasn't automatic. So, why is there no national movement, people marching through the streets saying, universal dental care for all? And like, I honestly don't know why. I mean, one reason would be that the people who need dental care are not photogenic, almost literally, because if their teeth are rotted, then they don't look very good. They're probably very poor. They probably are not on Twitter. They may be older. They may have other problems with drug addiction or alcoholism or something that makes them not a sympathetic, person to put up on a commercial or something. But if we had universal dental care in America, it would be like a huge, utilitarian increase in the country. So why is there no movement? And I should just note that the one national level politician I've ever heard talk about dental care is Bernie Sanders.
There's no national movement for dental care because in order for there to be any national movement for any kind of health care, the stars have to align between corporate interests, the various sort of ideological preconceptions of the country, and the demographics of the country, right? So, look, I want to say this right up. I think that Obamacare is better than nothing, and I prefer America's post-Obamacare health system to its health system, the pre-Obamacare health system. That said, Obamacare is a heritage foundation plan, a plan that was conceived of by a lot of conservatives and Republicans that not only fails to address one of the central issues with America's health system, which is its incredible complexity, but made it vastly more complex, right? I mean, the sort of, for all the problems of a place like, let's not even say France, right? France is like the gold standard. Let's say a sort of national healthcare system that we all identify as having problems. The British healthcare system, okay? It is universal, and it also has a ton of deep problems, right? It is very simple, right, in terms of how it functions and what its basic sort of preconceptions and how it works, sort of this, right? Post-Obamacare and pre-Obamacare American healthcare were noted for their immense complexity. Well, why did a brand new plan, a plan that was trying to be sort of a new era in American healthcare, sort of complicate an already complicated system? Well, it complicated an already complicated system because Obama and his, in order to make this happen, but in order for this politically to happen, he had to placate the already existing medical industry, right?
Right.
I mean, Obamacare had the support of the existing health insurance system, and many people will tell you.
And so but the reason for that is that it's hard to imagine a plan passing that did not have.
Sure.
If the doctors across the country rallied against the plan, it would not pass because people trust their doctors.
That's true. And so when you ask why does dental care not included in this? Because the delicate interchange of sort of pay-to-play politics, right? Because the way it was not sort of set up, the system was not set up to be able to. The system was not set up in a way so that the establishment moneyed interests like the health insurance companies and the American Medical Association, it would not have been to their interest to include dental care, so it wasn't included. You're right. Like dentists would be happy.
Well, like the dentists would be happy. Dentists are wealthy people. Right. I'm sure the dentists have their own lobby or something. Right. So like, why didn't the dentist just put their hand out for the government subsidy? Like even like a Marxist reading of this would think that like yes the dentists want money.
Right, but see, but this is again like this is part of what makes the reason for the complexity is this just massive angle of competing interests between the politicians who want low taxes and the constituencies that want them to have low taxes, which are the wealthy and this sort of the white working class who for some reason support the same policies that the wealthy want, and the pre-existing healthcare system and the American Medical Association. For whatever reason, the stars were not aligned in such a way so that I'm sure the dentists wanted more customers, right? But that desire was not enough to outweigh the negative impact, the sort of negative impact that it would have brought to the plan. So in other words, if it would have required raising corporate taxes to a certain degree, and that the pressure not to avoid those corporate taxes outweighed the political pressure that the dentist could bring to bear, that's why it didn't happen.
Okay, so then let's bring this back to let's just look at the dental aspect for another minute. So why is there no college campus activism around dental rights? This imaginary thing I just made up, dental rights, and so I mean the things are what I said previously. Like college students they have dental care, so it's not something that impacts them directly.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly, it's not a sexy issue. It's like the people who need dental care are
Mm-hmm.
older people, poor people. They're not the people you see like waiting for the bus. They're not going to be on the cover of Time magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so like so like that's so like universal dental care is like a concrete thing that liberal activists or left activists could demand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible to imagine if Bernie Sanders does run, he somehow extracts a promise
Mm-hmm.
from Hillary Clinton to put universal dental care as one of her planks, and who knows if it could ever get through a Republican Congress? Probably not. But like how do we decide that like transgender issues are like a bigger deserving of more activist energy than like dental issues?
Yeah, I mean, nobody decides, right? I mean, college is it has been democratized to a great degree in the last several decades, but it still remains a more affluent phenomenon than the rest of the country. It remains
Mm-hmm.
a wider phenomenon in the rest of the country. College people in college tend to have parents who themselves have college degrees. Also, the people who attend college who are most likely to need dental care are also those who are most likely to be at colleges that don't have dorms, right? That are community colleges, and they're also the
Right.
ones who are most likely to be working students who don't have time to attend organizing meetings. Yeah. So in other words, you're asking why does an issue like dental care not sort of that sort of flashpoint trigger of like trans issues? When I mean, even the most enthusiastic trans advocate will tell you that trans people are a very small portion of the population, right?
Right.
Because
So why is no one ever told check your dental privilege?
right, it's a good question, Ari. Because
because dental privilege is a real thing. Like if you're missing a bunch of teeth, like you're gonna have a hard time getting a job. You're gonna have a hard time meeting
right,
a life partner. Like your life, and you might be in serious pain. Like your life is, if you don't have dental care, like your life is bad.
because I mean, the thing about identity politics is that they sort of function according to this sort of like existential. It's sort of you have to be able to identify someone that you say is sort of existentially oppressed, right? So that you have to say that like you can gain or lose health coverage, right? Your teeth can get worse, or they can get better, but identity politics sort of stems from the assumption that oppression is sort of this baked-in function of identity of people from these groups. And of course, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, these groups are deeply and sort of oppressed by virtue of who they are. But in terms of a sort of communicative and emotional and sort of political system, for whatever reason, these kind of politics are only enforced when you can sort of say you are hurting X person rather than you're focusing on X issue.
Right. Right. And I think this we're kind of going towards the end of our time, but just one other thing I wanted to say about this. This kind of like check your privilege has kind of become the cliche thing of this kind of politics, and check your privilege is kind of a good thing to do sometimes. I think when it's used to shut down debate, it's bad. But like the things that let's go back to dentistry. There's a lot of things that aren't included in check your privilege that actually make you a more or less privileged person.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing is whether or not you were raised in a two-parent household.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever you are, whatever race or class or gender, if you were raised by a single parent, like your life outcomes are more likely to be bad
Mm-hmm.
than if you were raised in a two-parent household. But there's no check your there's no saying like, oh, my dad left when I was 4. Like, check your privilege.
Right.
Like, no one, as far as I know, ever says something like that.
Right.
Or like check the privilege of, like your mother not drinking when she was pregnant with you.
Yeah. And look, like one of the most surefire signs that someone is privileged is if they use the phrase check your privilege, because generally speaking, only people who have come from a certain level of education know what that phrase is or know what it means, right? Yeah.
Right.
The
Right.
other thing about privilege checking is that accomplish anything, right? Like, of course you need to know that you're privileged. And let me tell everyone out there in Blogging Kids world that I'm a very profoundly fortunate and lucky person. But just checking it doesn't do anything. And this is the thing that's happened. I mean, I can't tell you how many graduate seminars I sat in, someone raised their hand, well, I'm going to check my privilege now. It's like, okay, you checked it, so what, right? Like, it's like that ritual is, I mean, that's great, but like, what are you going to do about it, And there's a fundamentally sense in which that is a sort of purity ritual that has become totally divorced from the people it's meant to actually serve,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you saying purity ritual made me think of Michael Brendan Doherty's recent piece on this, where he kind of compared this to kind of Christian ethics, and there's unsettling parallels between how kind of debates within the Protestant Church or something, right. And this kind of like martyrs and purity and heretics. These are like terms related to wars in Christianity, right. and somehow a bunch of secular college students have adopted them. So we've gone kind of long. Do you still want to talk about Selma or some other topic?
No, I just want to let's close up. But I want to make one point when we do, which is I didn't really get a chance to talk about all my sort of critiques of sort of where John Chait is coming from. But I want to say this. I wrote a thing this morning to say like I've gotten a bunch of emails about this piece. I've gotten like something like 500 emails about these pieces that I've been writing, which is great. I'm very appreciative of reading them. And a lot of them sort of say right on. A lot of them very annoyingly presumed that my criticisms of John Chait are what they call throat clearing, like or checking my ass. In other words, like I don't really believe those things. And again, I encourage you to go check my archives to see how much I disagree with John Chait and have for years. But there's also just incredible irony is people sort of saying, I agree with you on political correctness, but you use some really harsh language on John Chait. Like, I swear to God, like people in the course of praising me for it to a certain degree, defending a piece about, that was saying we should have more freedom to express ourselves, they are sort of muttering darkly about my expression, right? So I just got one this morning. It's like, you use harsh language with John Chait. That's not going to be good for your career. People in media and people in Academy, they don't want to hear that stuff. And so in the process of praising me for writing a piece in which I say, yeah, we should be more forgiving, they sort of embed this sort of threat, right? And in my actual life, even as someone who has been in all the environments that I'm saying I am, and even as someone who observes the actual negative consequences of language policing in my life, the threat to me is not from language policing of the kind we're talking about, right? I mean, look, I watch myself and I make sure I try not to say anything offensive, and I'm guarded and careful when I talk about certain topics. But I don't feel like my career is going to be ruined by accidentally saying something ableist, right? My concern is that someone won't like that I'm harsh about a topic, or that I breach sort of decorum and civility. And that is just like if you really want to talk about like a free exchange of ideas, like the cult of civility and the cult of decorum, to me, and for my life, and I think for a lot of academics, that's far more sort of powerfully censorious than anything else. Stephen Saleta was a tenured professor who had a job at the University of Illinois, and he lost it because he was intemperate in his criticism of Israel. As someone who has written a lot of sort of passionate pieces about Israel and Palestine, that is much more of a threat to me in my career than political correctness. And none of the people, or very few of the people, who sort of rage against political correctness stand up and also say, and also these civility norms, which protect the powerful rather than the powerless, those are actually part of the problem also. So it's a very selective endorsement of the idea of free exchange. You feel me?
Right. Yeah. And just like I said, I think, so Chait's piece is open to criticism, and, I'm sure Chait has policed norms, that in ways that we would, the objective observer would not approve of. Mm-hmm. I once again come back to, the people who think more speech and debate is a good thing, and the people who think more speech and debate is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. So this is not, this does not divide along ideological lines. There are people on any side who just say, you people over there, you should shut up. Mm-hmm. You're not helping things. Just shut up. Mm-hmm. And then there's people who say, like, we welcome the free exchange of ideas. So I work for Blogging Heads. I am interested in fostering debate and bringing people of opposing ideological views to debate. But there are people who honestly say, like, everything would be better if you just shut up. And that's really what a lot of this political correctness thing is. It's just saying, it's trying to get people to shut up.
Right.
And I think we both agree that there are times when we should not shut up, and probably more times when we should not shut up than times when we should shut up.
Right, that's true.
Although maybe our viewers after 70 minutes of this are saying to both of us,
shut up.
You should both shut up.
All right.
So we should probably wrap it up there. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, thanks a lot, Aryeh. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, thanks so much, and thanks to all of our viewers, and we'll see you again next time.
See ya.